Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Whitney. Welcome to tonight's program, a conversation with Laura Poitras and Joshua Oppenheimer. And my name is Megan Hoyer. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Whitney. I have just a very quick introduction and a couple thanks. So tonight's program is first part of a series of events organized with in tandem with Laura Poitras' exhibition Astro Noise, which is on view here on the 8th floor. If you haven't yet seen the show, the galleries are open tonight until 10 p.m., so just a quick plug to go see it after the show before dinner, or come back again to see it then. And I just really want to take a moment to thank Laura for the incredible show, and also her team, especially Yoni Golihov and Brenda Coughlin, for their collaboration on these events. Tonight's program is also a collaboration in another sense. It's a collaboration with the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation in honor of their 35th anniversary of the MacArthur Fellows Program, which recognizes the contributions, as I assume many of you know, of exceptionally creative people who inspire us all, including Laura and Joshua. I'm really grateful to all the folks at MacArthur, especially Donnie Meyer, for giving us the occasion to invite Joshua to be part of these events at the Whitney and to host this conversation between two of the most thoughtful and critical documentary filmmakers working today. The other thing I have to plug is that if you haven't yet seen Joshua's film, The Look of Silence, which is nominated for this year's Academy Award for Best Documentary, we are showing it here in this very room tomorrow at 1 p.m. With the remarks from Joshua following the film. So I think there are a few tickets available if anyone wants to join us again. And finally, I have the pleasure of introducing Eric Hynes, who's our moderator for this evening. Eric is Associate Curator at of Film at the Museum of the Moving Image. He's also a journalist and film critic, writing a weekly column on the art of nonfiction film for Film Comment. Other outlets include the New York Times, Rolling Stone, Slate, The Intercept, Sight and Sound, The Village Voice, and Reverse Shot, where he's been a staff writer since 2004 and host of the ongoing Talkies video interview series. So I'm going to turn things over to Eric to introduce our speakers. And thank you so much for coming.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay in the back, all right? Okay. So I just want to briefly introduce the two of, I mean, obviously you're here to see these two speak. But we'll briefly talk about the fact that you're in the company of two of the greatest filmmakers of our time, and two Oscar-nominated, one Oscar-winning filmmaker. Joshua's up for his, he's nominated again this year for the Academy Award. And I mean, between them, there are, in terms of 21st century filmmaking, pretty much without competition in terms of documentary filmmakers. But I also think that it's worth talking about, and I think this influences a lot of what we're about to maybe get into, is we're dealing with two artists as well. It's two artists who work in film, but whose artistry transcends film. And obviously, in the sense that upstairs, Laura's exhibit, Astro Noise, which if you haven't seen, please go see this evening, or as soon as you can, is an expression of how that artistry spills beyond the feature film format. That the fact that they are documentary filmmakers and are artists is something that should not be questioned, but I think in this moment in time, that can't be stressed nearly enough. And I think talking about the art of nonfiction filmmaking is very important. What's funny, though, about that is that when you start using words like artist in relation to documentary film, there becomes maybe a fear or an assumption that that's about art for art's sake, and it's actually not about. It's about itself, and maybe it's involved with itself. And you could never ever say that about either of your films. You're not artists who are making art for art's sake. You're artists who are looking to use art to communicate, to express, to provoke, to elicit emotion. And I think that you're artists whose end game is not art. At the same time, you are clearly politically engaged people whose end game is also not politics. And I think that's an interesting terrain to be in for anyone. And I think a very limited group of people can claim that space. And it's a space that's quite elevated by your work. So I wanted to just start the discussion, if you don't mind, Laura, by reading a little bit from your diaries, which is...
Can I leave now?
Which is part of the book that accompanies the exhibit, which is a fantastic document, and tellingly is very indirectly about the exhibit and about a lot of the issues that have come up around the exhibit and other people's takes on what Laura's doing, as well as on the issues that Laura's approaching. But there's an entry. What's the date here? Hold on. From December. On Christmas Day, 2012, where you say. It is all about asking people to imagine the existential hell. If that space can be accessed, the connection to that experience, then what is said might have impact. Ultimately, it is about that expression, to say something in a way that moves people. It is not a device, it is the gauge of the quality of the work itself. And I thought that would be a nice place to start to talk about the work that both of you are doing, that you're actually conscious and thinking of eliciting emotion, communicating things, reaching an audience. And here you are in an apartment in Berlin working on a film and thinking already about how this might reach people and what that might do. And I'd love to just begin to talk about a little bit of even in the middle of what you're doing, you don't even know what the structure or the form you might take, but you are still thinking about communicating.
Sure. Thank you for the generous introduction. Thank you all for coming. I suppose for me, what I'm always looking for is something like a metaphor. I'm looking for images that seem to embody not just that which fascinates me, but the problems that I cannot look away from. And I think I'm often, particularly what draws me to work, and I think is particularly well suited to metaphor, is is almost an intolerance for pretense, for denial, for hypocrisy. And the reason that I think is suitable for metaphor is because with hypocrisy, particularly political hypocrisy, you have some bitter truth and you have some sugarcoating, some immoral imagination, some lie that's created to naturalize the thing that's unbearable. And the lie eventually becomes so naked and stark that it itself becomes a kind of metaphor. So I have my eye out for these things, and I spent in the 10 years, 12 years, 11 years, I can't quite remember, that I spent working on the legacy of the genocide in Indonesia, from the boasting of the perpetrators and their various proposals that they wanted to dramatize what they had done in more and more elaborate ways. This sort of screaming, incandescent, but ultimately ugly metaphor of death squad members making a musical started to appear in the kind of mist around me. It started to take shape, maybe the mist is the wrong way of speaking about it. It started to appear almost like a pole star. It was something that was guiding me, even though I was searching and groping. And then the idea of communicating to an audience is implicit there, because the idea is, how do we create a reality where such a metaphor might emerge for real? How do we create a new historical reality, a reality, that is to say, of historic importance, where real participants and real life would come together to create new phenomena like Death Squad members making a musical, as an example, that would be so shocking that it would reveal the barbarity of the lie, the barbarity of the immoral imagination that would be glorifying something awful, and in this case, the perpetrator's victor's history, which is glorifying something as awful as genocide. And then the question is, how do we get there, and what steps can I take with my participants and I'm not fixed on going there. If it goes in another direction, that's fine. But what steps can I take that will both lead to these metaphors, and then what can I film that allows me to that allows a viewer to access and perceive the meaning of these metaphors, that allows you to perceive the horror, the tragedy, not just of what's being covered up, but of the cover-up itself. And so I have this desire to search for, so implicit in looking for metaphors is the sense of what do I film, what do I create with my participants that will allow a viewer to perceive the metaphors, to be immersed in them, but from a moral perspective, from a moral and political perspective. That was very abstract, but it was an abstract question, wasn't it?
It was indeed.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be here. And with Joshua, whose work I really love, and which provides this insight into what happens when you have cultures of impunity that are allowed to exist for generations. And I think that there is so much that unites our work. And then when listening to you talk, I'm actually thinking that I have my tactics are different, or the strategies that I try to get at similar things I use different ways in. And so for me, it's I'm really interested in how primary documents can be leveraged to open up a space where we actually can connect on an emotional level. And the work, or the current body of work that I'm doing, I think it grew out of watching what was happening, the build up to the Iraq War, and then the first months of the coverage of the Iraq War, and reading the paper and seeing body counts every day. And people were reading it, and it wasn't penetrating into anyone's consciousness or emotion. And then I made this first film, which is about the Iraq War, and went there with this idea of kind of achieving two things. One is to create a record, because I think records are important that for the present tense and for the future, that we actually know what happens in places, and that those can be both incredibly useful in the present tense and in the future. So by going there and documenting the war is creating of a primary document, and then also how to turn that into narrative experiences and leverage, which is more things around emotion, so that people, to shift perspectives so that we can imagine the destruction that we see in other places as if it were ourselves, our neighborhoods, the people we care about. And for me, I just feel that there's something always sort of latent within primary documents and how to sort of extract their meaning. And I think of it more, not so much in terms of working in metaphors, but working in dialectical relationships, that I'm interested in the empirical world, that the empirical world does have a sort of force, and that you have to bend your practice to that force. And you go into a project with a certain set of ideas, and then you're confronted with people and realities, and they change those ideas, and that there's a dialectical relationship between what you do as a filmmaker, as a documentary filmmaker, as an artist, which is telling those stories and carving out some sort of a relationship. So I'm not like a naive idea that filmmaking is truth per se, but you are bound by realities, and you're bound by things like the security of the people that you're filming and other types of realities. And so that's kind of the sort of dual things. It's like creating records or working with existing primary documents from other sources, and how to extract what I feel is latent in them and put them into a narrative context, with always the goal of having some kind of emotive relationship. Like, I feel that in my work, if I can't get that, then it sort of fails. And what I was saying in that entry is, it's not a device. Like, I don't feel like I do this because I'm trying to manipulate a viewer, but rather, if you're making a film about, these kinds of issues, and you can't move people emotionally, then you've done something wrong. So.
It's interesting. There's two things that you said, that Laura, that really stick with me. One is the idea that there is a concrete reality that you have to bend to, and I very much agree with that. And I actually think there's moments in actually most great works of nonfiction cinema, certainly in your films, and I've tried to work with these in mind. I don't know if I've succeeded, but there's moments where reality sort of pierces through the tissue of narrative, the space of the film, and takes you beyond language, takes you to something totally indigestible. And I actually think, I don't know, I was just having a discussion yesterday about the end of each of my films, The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence, whether it's Anwar retching at the end of The Act of Killing, and at the end of The Look of Silence, this little clip that Adi shot of his father crawling through the house, lost, calling for help, think in sort of an advanced state of dementia, thinking he's in someone else's home and is going to be beaten up, trapped in the fear of what happened to the family in 1965. There's this feeling that these are these indigestible moments that almost are a disruption in the film necessarily. I think actually there were parts in Citizen 4, sections of the film in the hotel room, which are like that, where it's beyond. There's a mystery there that's beyond any kind of effort to create coherence, and that hints at what must be motivating the search, right? Because I feel your work is very, very searching, and it's just the way that these moments that are beyond words erupt into a film is, I think, somehow very important in that regard. And there was something else. There was one other thing which was a much more concrete answer to your first question about how I try to engage audiences emotionally. And it was just, as you were saying it, as you were speaking, I was remembering a discussion we had in July about storytelling in one evening, and I was thinking about how I don't really think of what I do as storytelling. I think storytelling is a kind of imprecise metaphor for the experience of watching a film. And what I try to do is to create a series of moments, of moods, of spaces, of tones that you don't just see and hear but also feel in your body, experiences where you're immersed in spaces, not just physical spaces, but spaces where spaces which give expression to the poetic and political and moral truth, and those are all one. That is of that space, which are things that are normally invisible, where you're immersed in that space. So in The Look of Silence, it's a space of fear and silence and ghosts, things you wouldn't normally see if you just wander as a visitor into an Indonesian village. I want to immerse you in these spaces, but with a moral point of view, and to create a succession of them that constitutes for you as an audience an experience, cumulatively. And one of the magic of cinema is we can all sit in a room coming from all the places we come, all the infinity of each of our lives, the boundlessness that we all carry within us as people, and we can sit in a room together, and suddenly this thing that I've made and this crew has made over many, many years, some of them risking their lives, forms this experience that we all share. And it is that shared experience that I think I'm trying to create more than, and I would never think of it as I'm trying to engage an audience, though of course you have to engage an audience as a first step towards that. And storytelling is sort of but an imprecise metaphor for this idea of this shared experience.
That was fantastic. It was wonderful. And so there's a million things that I want to get into about all of that. Well, I think maybe it would be a great thing to step back a little bit and talk about to each of you about this moment where I started from that almost inchoate moment of how am I going to shape this? How am I going to reach people? I'm in the weeds here, but there's a way forward. What's that way forward? I'd love to talk, Laura, you see this an amazing metaphor that I can't recall, and Joshua, you paraphrase it as well. It's like reality or the events sort of imposing themselves on your craft or on your work. I'd love to talk a little bit about how that worked, how that has functioned for you, both in the sense of, in this moment, resulting in Citizen 4, but then what's amazing about reading through these journals is that you're also coming up with ideas for what's going to be Astro Noise, too. You're reacting in various ways, and you're thinking of different ways of artistically pursuing works that react to what's being imposed on you.
Right. I mean, sort of dovetailing this question of storytelling or narrative, I mean, what I'm interested always, and that's what I love about this tradition of cinema verite documentary that I do, which is trying to be in places where things are happening in real time in front of you, and when you're there, you actually have no idea what's next, and that's kind of like the sort of the palpable reality of sort of human existence, like what, there are lots, when you're in sort of in the present tense, you oftentimes don't understand everything. You understand things more in retrospect. And so I'm interested in locating stories that happen in that moment and then after the fact, because a certain amount of time transpires and then you look back and you say, oh, there's a story there, look, and then crafting the story. But I think it's like capturing this sort of uncertainty and this, like being in sort of situations of what feel a bit like free fall. I really am interested in working with, and it was very much working with, I don't know if Jay Saunders is in the room, the curator of the show. Is Jay here? He comes from a performance background. So he brought me in to do the show. And so I think he likes this idea of the sort of live unpredictability and working with, in this installation context, it was wonderful to work with somebody who opened up or allowed that space that I use in a filmmaking context, but to strip it of what you would consider to be plot in that sense. But it's always about trying to capture that. And so the journal that's in the book got there sort of by accident. I had when we first started talking about the book, I didn't want it to be sort of an academic exercise. Like I think that's just really not interesting. I don't want to read theory if it's not grounded to something real. So we approached it differently. And one of the first commissions that I wanted to do was with a man named Loktar Bromedian, who was a prisoner at Guantanamo, and he was there for several years, and he was on hunger strike for 2 years, or 2 years and 4 months. So for 2 years and 4 months, he was force-fed. And I'd met him, I'd interviewed him, and when we talked about the book, that was like one of the first things I wanted to do is reach out to say, okay, we're going to commission different writers, and to bring him in and commission him and have a museum commission somebody who's a former prisoner and to ask him, like, how did you navigate that emotionally and mentally in existential terms, not just physical terms. And so that was sort of a grounding point for the book, and then the other pieces came around it. And when I was working with Jay and working at some time frame in terms of the making Citizen 4, I found this journal that I had hidden away. And I started just pulling out some quotes because I thought it'd be useful for the book that they could use for other purposes. And then as I was typing it, I became very aware that it kind of was very similar to the type of filming I do, which is being in the moment, total uncertainty. And there's something palpable in that. And so that's how it kind of arrived at being in the book, and why I decided to publish it, because it captured something that I was asking other people to share with me, and it related to that. And there is something in that yes, it's about narrative. I mean, we've been telling stories for a long time, and I actually I do think storytelling is a useful reference in the sense that it's been going on for so long that for some reason human beings have to make sense of the world, and one of the ways that they make sense of the world is through stories, and we do it over and over and over again. And so I find it such really something that I'd like to locate the work in, but in this notion of not storytelling after the fact where people think they have all the answers, but storytelling in the present tense.
Well, I think that what Joshua, you were saying in terms of creating a space through your work applies certainly to what you were doing in a certain respect in terms in Citizen 4, and certainly what you're responding to in terms of those scenes with Edward Snowden are certainly putting us into a space, an incredibly an intense and unforgettable space that I think works, whether it was metaphorical or not. Certainly, probably in all of us who've seen that, we've all sort of been in that room and probably haven't left that room. I think that's what that means in terms of how we have been trapped by the surveillance state, and that's sort of our sort of in between liminal state that we remain. But then I think obviously we're talking about a space upstairs as well that you've created for us to move through. Can we talk, Josh, you were about to say something, or okay? No. Okay, because I'd love to then, if you don't mind, talk a little bit about the different narratives you've created in terms of your films, or sort of like, let's relate what the narrative you've created upstairs with the narrative of Citizen 4, which I think is a different film from your two previous films, and I think that in some ways it's leading towards where you wound up upstairs.
Yeah, I mean, again, sort of this idea of transcending narrative or stories, because I do think that there is something about an experience, or a narrative experience, which is, of course, at one point linked to whatever, a character, a drama that you're watching, but it's also, it's not. It's actually an experience that we have on a regular basis and have similar responses to, even though there's sort of diverse narratives that we might arrive at those types of spaces, or that kind of experiential relationship to work. So with working with the installation, what I was, we could, I don't know if you want to show. So we can show like a beginning of a short clip from Citizen 4, which is combining sort of primary documents with narrative and.
This isn't Citizen 4.
No, it's not Citizen 4. We're going to cycle through here, so give us a second. These are things we can get back to later. That was it before then. Thank you. We have here.
The encrypted archive should be available to you within 7 days. The key will follow when everything else is done. The material I provide and investigative effort required will be too much for any one person. I recommend, at a very minimum, you involve Glenn Greenwald. I believe you know him.
This file from Edward Snowden, and you can keep playing.
Keep going, I think Laura said.
Yeah, you can, yeah.
Keep playing. Keep playing. Oh, is that the end?
No, it should. I think it's paused or frozen there.
The encrypted archive should be available to you within 7 days. The key will follow when everything else is done. The material I provide and investigative effort required will be too much for any one person. I recommend, at a very minimum, you involve Glenn Greenwald. I believe you know him. The plain text of the payload will include my true name details for the record, though it will be your decision as to whether or how to declare my involvement. My personal desire is that you paint the target directly on my back. No one, not even my most trusted confidant, is aware of my intentions, and it would not be fair for them to fall under suspicion for my actions. You may be the only one who can prevent that, and that is by immediately nailing me to the cross, rather than trying to protect me as a source. On timing, regarding meeting up in Hong Kong. The first rendezvous attempt will be at 10 a.m. local time on Monday.
Stop it there and then go to...
We will meet in the hallway outside.
So we just advance to the next slide, if you don't mind. Thank you.
So, so that was, if I was to go back to this idea of working with primary documents as kind of my relationship, or how to extract things, there's meaning there. So this was, obviously it was a correspondence that Edward Snowden was sending me, and then and then I'm actually also downloading it. So there's a recording of the downloading of these NSA files that were encrypted at that point, and sort of being used to sort of arrive as sort of arriving to Hong Kong, where you meet this mysterious person. And then, so my experience with what was going on, and what I'm including in the journal, is that for a long time when I was receiving these emails, I thought this would be a person I would never meet. And so then I was left with these very frightening exchanges that I didn't know what would be the strategies that I would use to articulate them and to find a way. And so when I was in Berlin receiving these emails, I started doing a lot of journaling around how can I'd like to explore this material and structure it in an installation-based context. And so I started doing a lot of journaling, and that's kind of, I think, the origins of the work that's upstairs.
That came to you? That wasn't something you had thought of in previous projects before?
No, it was something I'd been wanting to do for a long time, and I had done it in 2010. I'd done an installation, and before that. So it was something I actually had felt with my filmmaking. Like, I think as creative people, we always want new challenges. Like, there's a sense of like, okay, what I'd like to work in this way. And so it was definitely what I felt, that this trilogy of films, like after that, I wanted to do something that presented different ways of doing the work and that I'm interested in, but that presented new challenges as well. And I was hungry for that. So I'd reached out to Jay before I'd gone to Hong Kong, and during this time when I didn't think I would meet Snowden. So what we're seeing here. This is a floor plan of the exhibition that's upstairs. And what I've been thinking about, or what I quickly, and Jay and I started talking about, and how I approached what I wanted to do, is how to create a narrative experience that has this sort of similar, like what Joshua was saying about experience of narrative and creating moods and zones, but that's somehow a bit divorced from what we think about as plot, which is, a character that three-act structure, beginning, middle, end, situation, conflict, resolution. But how can you arrive at those types of experiences with an audience without that plot, but that you get the narrative payoffs? And so when I started meeting with Jay and working with the floor plan, I mean, in a way, the space itself became the plot. That was sort of like what was going to drive everything, and looking at how what I wanted to do is not unsimilar to like this thing that I love about cinema that you also love, which is you bring people together in a space where they have this kind of collective experience and in a very personalized way. And that's just a beautiful thing about cinema, and I think it's so effective, and I wanted to sort of use those kinds of cinematic tools in the installation work. And so it was clear to me that I wanted a beginning, middle, and end, and to take the viewer audience on a journey. So the beginning, the beginning of the piece is on, sorry, this side.
Wait.
You enter from the elevators on what you would call, I guess, on your right. And it's the first piece, and then you go through these different sort of maze type. And
it's a chronological beginning as well.
It's a chronological beginning. So the first piece it's called Ose Can You See, and it goes back to 9/11, so it's material that I shot at 9/11. And then there's a screen that's hanging in the middle, and one side is spectators, or not actually spectators, mourners, I would call them, who were gathered at 9/11 right after, or soon after the towers were attacked and fell. And then the other side is a videotape of an interrogation that was conducted. And what I was interested in is like how, like by using space and how the space could be used as a narrative tool or narrative device. Maybe can you just go fast through the images till we get to the first video?
Was the video something that had been out in the public domain before this?
So that's a question that I've been not responding to.
Because I think it's because there's this sense of this, and this I'll talk about more later in relation to from something. So the present is intruding all the time in your work, and again, I just was seeing the show, whether it's the infrared and the people's phones being under surveillance. There's this way that the present is always there, and it's in your films too. And I was having a thought about that, and I was curious about it here. So this is on the second. It's the second thing you see once you've entered on this screen. So you're on one side of the screen, you cross to the other side, and these are the images. May I phrase it differently? Was it widely seen before? Is this something that people have widely seen? Is this a well-known clip?
Why do you ask?
Because for me, it was astounding that I hadn't seen this before, and I thought, and so the experience of watching upstairs was deeply moving because it felt historic. So I thank you for that. I thank you for the experience and the feeling.
That is exactly the type of response that I'm trying to get.
Oh, you got it. And it's great.
So this was recorded. You can let it play. This was recorded in November 2009. So I think we can stop there. And so, not to not address this question. So one of I've been working with the reporting on the Snowden documents for a over a year, and working in the news context, it was always this question of what was new and what was not new, and that somehow was the barometer for what had meaning. And what I am very much trying to do is push against that, to work with primary documents and say, this has meaning whether or not it's the first time anyone's seen it or not. So there are material that's on exhibit on the 8th floor that have never been published before. For instance, there's a memo by George Tenet, written regarding collaboration between the CIA and the NSA. It hadn't been published before, and then there were documents that had been published before. And so, for me, the meaning of those is not determined by whether or not they had been. Yeah, I know.
No, I think you're actually, what's powerful is you're actually, now that you say that, that's absolutely correct. You're drawing attention to the tragic way in which many of these documents maybe are habitually overlooked or ignored or dismissed.
And just also having the chance and the opportunity to work within a museum context and actually be liberated of maybe what would be sort of need to knows in a documentary context or a news context. You don't get to write a news story and say, I'm not going to source it, but in this context I felt I could do that, and for particular reasons of getting at certain types of relationships to the work.
Can you talk a little bit about what the space offers you? Because these are two clips that they could be put together. There could be an edit. There could be a cut that goes from one to the next. But we don't have that. We have continuous playing on either side of a screen. What does that afford? That
Right. I mean, again, it's like what was so exciting about doing something in a museum context or in a physical space is that to be able to leverage space, and so that the space itself becomes part of the creating of the narrative. And so, yeah, you're right. I could juxtapose one thing from another, which is what I do all the time with single channel, long form work. But I think that there's actually something very powerful that you encounter one thing and you're asking the viewer to sort of cross, and then they're creating the edit and a sense of the discovery, and to sort of allow to hand over that the ability to create those juxtapositions to the viewer and not to be in control of those things. And so that was one of the things that working in long form, as much as I love it, you are absolutely the controller of time and duration and those kinds of things. And in the context of doing installation, then I get to hand that over. So you can spend 15 minutes and watch this interrogation, or you can pass by it in 30 seconds or 5 seconds.
is there something that's terrifying about that though too? That you giving
No, it's
people
fantastic. No, I mean,
you're also giving the opportunity for them to spend no time on it.
Right, but so by using, can we go back to the floor plan? So, but by being able to work with space, you get to, I mean, there's a new kind of control that you get, which is a control over space. So there is a kind of asking the viewer to enter at a certain place and then go around and then be able to create these, what I would call narrative moments, reveals, reversals, discoveries, and then also asking, like the going to a movie you get a captive audience, which is a great thing, but that's also an audience that is, somewhat leaning back, and this is kind of asking the audience to cross over and to enter into spaces, to enter into a dark space, to lie down, to have to reach for things, and all that, be able to work with the kind of physicality and spatial qualities was great, and I didn't have any problems with relinquishing the control over time. I thought, that's great, and it allows me to let things play longer. I was talking recently about a film, Steve McQueen film, Hunger, which has this incredible scene in the middle of it. That's like a 15-minute scene, and it's so radical to have a 15-minute scene in the middle of a movie. And so with movies, it's hard to have that kind of duration. So in this,
and in one shot.
In a one shot, yeah. So it's incredible. So I was very interested in how space itself could be used to explore issues that I've been exploring in my work.
Well, and it makes its way into the body too. Like you're familiar with, you're aware of us moving through space, but you're also aware of what our bodies might be doing in various moments. It's interesting that as you were describing what you were doing, it's interesting that the next room is one that is an actual full body experience. So it's one thing for us to be able to work our way around a screen and orient ourselves and control how much time we're spending. And then the next scene is almost like our own bodies are being controlled by you or by the exhibit as well. So that physical interaction is really
Yeah, I mean, we were really interested, Jay and I, in creating those experiences, and then and the space really became the driver. You know, the some of the pieces shifted depending on what we felt was like the right juxtaposition and wanting to hit different notes at different time. But the space was the sort of the narrative driver, and the space of asking people to do certain things. That there is asking them to lie down, be vulnerable, and how to flip that, because we wanted to flip it in the experience.
And then there's the next room where there's the sense of looking through peepholes or prison slots or various other associations that come from that, which looks. You're both invited to do so, but also there's something illicit about it as well. You're questioning what you're looking at and why, and how long you're looking at it, which is quite a thing to sort of be taken in. I mean, to be looking at those documents, looking at those items, but then questioning your own relationship to them. It's very powerful. But something that Joshua and I were talking about about this piece, but I think is a natural transition. You even brought it up yourself. The present tenseness, the fact that here we are, going through a narrative, and it is a chronological narrative, but you're also very much in the present. You're in your own body. You're in your own thoughts. You're experiencing this in the moment. And how in your work, Joshua, that's something that you're what you're aiming at is for us to have a present tense experience, even though you're addressing through your two films, something that traumatic, intense, incredible, horrible, something that needs to be reckoned with, moment of history. But in some ways, what is most important is the now, and how people are living in there now, and how we're responding to the art now.
Well, I mean, definitely, I don't see either of my films as about the 1965 genocide, historical films about what happened 50 years ago. They're about impunity today. They're about what happens when perpetrators win, are free to write their own history, to lie to themselves about what they've done so that they can live with themselves, and then the terrible corruption and fear that's inevitable when that's imposed on a whole society. And in the uncut version of my first film, The Act of Killings, what's out in the United States is the director's cut, though it's not really a director's cut because director's cuts are made afterwards and out of regret. This is the original film, and it's the film that came out in theaters. It is the theatrical cut all over the world, except for the United States. So, and you can see it it's on Netflix and on DVD but it's out as the director's cut, The Act of Killing director's cut. Anyways, I think that I'm not even, we not only are in this present tense, but I think we are almost in free fall with the protagonist, Anwar Congo, lost in his nightmares, such that the film maybe becomes this kind of like, or lost in his fantasy, so it becomes this kind of fever dream. I'm not sure that it's a documentary, and I'm thinking about that, but it's cut through by these moments of of silence, these haunted spaces where the film shifts perspective from the perpetrators to the absent dead, to the ghosts who haunt the space in which the perpetrator's fever dream is, if you like, unfolding. And these are, and making the second film, The Look of Silence, I wanted to take you and immerse you in any one of those haunted silences, in any of those one of those haunted spaces, and make you feel what is it like to live surrounded by the men who killed your loved ones, and also in a very present tense way. And I think that, and thinking about that, I started to sort of decide that maybe the distance of objectivity should be contrasted to the immersion of truth. And maybe this is because I think we see films almost with our bodies. And one thing that I was thinking about when you were talking earlier about, you used the word verité, and of course the person who coined that word was Jean Rouch, and he didn't talk about the cinema verité camera as documenting reality, he talked about it as provoking reality. And I mentioned earlier, I sort of alluded to creating reality with my participants, and I think what I try to do is I try to take these long, intimate journeys together with my participants where we create new realities, historic realities, whether it's the confrontations between survivor and perpetrator in The Look of Silence or the dramatizations in The Act of Killing, the latter of which would function as a kind of ultimately not just as a mirror for the protagonist, but as a mirror for the whole society of Indonesia. So these were historic occasions, the realities we were creating. And yet, for those to be meaningful, they must be uncomfortable for everybody involved, for the perpetrators, for the survivors, if there's survivors in the scenes, for myself, and also for them to be honest. Therefore, they have to be also uncomfortable for you as viewers in some way. Otherwise, there would be a truth that's being hidden. And I think what I just rewatched The Oath in preparation for sitting with you today, which is one of my favorite films. And I was thinking about, and then I started thinking about Citizen4 and My Country, and started thinking about how there is this sort of way in which your presence, your searching quality, your anguished need to somehow explore what is this our country was turned inside out and upside down after September 11th, and for what, and for why, and you're entering these situations that are, you are also, your camera is also provoking the encounters, and it is also, it is creating the present, the moments, the interactions, whether it's with the protagonist, the main character. I'll call him the main character rather than the protagonist in The Oath. You're constant. Your camera is an intervention, and in a way that does justice to the original intended meaning of cinema verite. It's not filming a simulated reality in which everyone's pretending that the camera is not present. It is a world provoked by your exploration, and that's what makes your film so gripping, because you're feeling like the world is being revealed through, not because you're documenting it, but because you have come, most improbably, to provoke it in this way. And that, yeah, I was just thinking about that there's much more in common between our practices than I had thought about before.
I very much obviously agree that the camera being present is going to change the dynamics, and I've always felt that I'm very much in my films because I'm usually behind the camera, and being behind the camera is you're part of the scene. You know, it's in a sense it's the first person position, and
Yeah.
But is that so? All what he was saying is pretty fair in terms of how, because I think it's interesting to me is how you're both quite different filmmakers, and there are commonalities. You're saying they're more similar than they might appear, but you are coming from different places, and maybe whether it's philosophically or repertorially.
I would say more tactically.
Tactically,
Like we use different ways to get at similar types of.
yeah.
Or is this what we've become? Would this be me in that situation? Could I do that? What if I lived surrounded by what if my son was killed and I lived surrounded by the men who killed him? What if I were Edward Snowden? And there's a moment of recognition, and that's what makes the work important, I think. And that's what makes it impactful, to go back to your very first question. So it's never the shock of the new, it's the shock of the familiar. And one of the things that, Laura, you do by returning to these documents and by also not revealing whether it's new or not, is insisting that that there's a kind of habit of anguished outrage that we do very well in this country. I think, as an American, I don't live in America, but I feel at liberty to say this. I think that the torture revelations.
You put your time in here. It's okay.
Came out, yeah. The torture revelations come out in some similar form every year. The same thing, again and again. And we wring our hands and we ask, what shall we do? And isn't this terrible? And it's like, instead of expiation, we just go through this ritual anguish and do nothing. And I think that in you having us revisit things and encounter them with this shock of recognition, you make us question that. And so it is similar to, it is actually going all the way back to what I was talking about earlier about there being, and maybe I'm just projecting my own fascinations onto your work, but what I said at the beginning about kind of moral, about being fascinated with denial, being fascinated, not just with exposing, the task is not just to expose the horror that took place, but to also expose the terrible costs of the denial, of the lie, of the escapism. And somehow your work has brought me into contact with and with that ritual of passive anguish. It's something that and you're in good company. I mean, I think the writer Mark Danner has done that in his reporting on frozen scandals and the war on terror. But no one has found a way of doing it with images and sounds and in such an immediately relevant way to the sort of unfolding nightmare that's all around us that we all know, and yet we like the king in the emperor's new clothes, it's worse than that, because it's not like we just say the king is wearing a beautiful suit of clothes. We all say, no, he's naked, and isn't it terrible that we have to pretend he's wearing a suit of new clothes? And we feel awful about it, and then we feel good about feeling awful about it, and we move on.
Well, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think of in terms of doing work that, I mean, there's a long documentary tradition of filming those suffering people over there, and which is a very satisfying. As the audience, you get to emote, you get to think you feel you're relating to somebody suffering, and then you go about, and it's in a sense
you get to feel good about yourself.
You get to feel good about yourself and the cycle. And so I think that, which I haven't thought about that much until now, is this idea of what are strategies to implicate the viewer and the audience, to implicate them in the sort of acts that you're not just there to sort of passively sympathize, but what happens when you're actually implicated in the events that you're seeing, and recognize yourself in them.
That's what's so great about, because I just arrived in New York and I'm going to see the show at length tomorrow, but had a quick look and couldn't pull myself away from the clip of the interrogation, and couldn't pull myself away from the end of the show, and the benches in the middle where people were lying down were full, so I didn't get to lie down. But I had this feeling of, but what we want to do is implicate people, make people aware of how they're implicated by making people aware of how they look away. And going through your show with a time limit forced me to be aware of when I was looking away. Here were these clearly vital documents that I didn't have time to read properly, to try and digest, to try to understand. So even this thing that would scare me about doing an installation, about not having control over time, there's something really wonderful about how it then implicates the viewer, because they're conscious of not giving these monumentally important things the time they deserve. And so even that implicates, even the busy, distracted viewer, at least the feeling ones, are implicated.
Well, I mean, so Joshua, you're talking about the idea of working against passivity, that there is a passive engagement with documentary film that is out there, as you're saying, like feeling good about having felt bad, which both of your work dismantles and works against. And I think part of that is, I think a major reason that you've achieved working against that is you're both working in new forms. You're looking to find a form to communicate. I think what often happens is there's a borrowed form that's used, and if you use a borrowed form of how a story is supposed to be told, or how you're supposed to get an emotional reaction, you'll get that reaction, but then you'll just get that reaction. And I think we were both working with looking for a different form from the inside. Joshua, you want to?
It's not out of a kind of intellectual choice. I mean, if I'm editing a film and I make a choice where it's slightly sentimental, without even realizing, it's like a knife to the...
I'm going to interrupt. How many people here have seen The Act of Killing? All right. Okay, I was going to say, if not, then it might be worth describing what happens with that film in terms of...
But and how many of you have seen The Look of Silence? Oh, quite a few. Well, the rest of you come tomorrow. It's probably going to be, you'll probably be the whole audience if you're here tomorrow, and then I'll be here. Anyways, I think that it's not out of like an intellectual desire to innovate. It's just that I'd feel sick inheriting the sentimentality that comes with received forms of filmmaking, and I think certainly I think all great films, and I'm not saying I've made great films, but all great films that even if they're working within existing forms, even when they're sentimental, are working with the sentimentality in an artful way. To bring Kundera talked about sentimentality as a kind of second tier that you cry. You cry the first tier because something's really sad, and you cry the second tier because you're enjoying the fellowship of man crying that first tier with you. You know, everyone's crying together. And that's a way of escaping from the pain of the first tier. So sentimentality is, I think, inherently escapist. And so and the self-pitying tier, which is much of the tears we cry, are also inherently escapist somehow from the changes we might need to make to move beyond the pain. I'm not judging it as wrong, but in film, when we have sentimentality, we should struggle, and I think great works even of maybe Douglas Sirk, which are highly sentimental, bring us, and Fassbinder, who's worked with Douglas Sirk, worked off of Douglas Sirk, I mean, they should bring us to a sentimentality. They should bring us from that second tier of sentimentality to like a third tier, where we perceive the tragedy of the escapism inherent in the sentimental reaction to the sad thing. And it's just a feeling of it when you're working, like you couldn't bear, whether it's an editing decision or you try something and it feels sentimental, and I just can't bear it. My editor teases me because he says you have this like hyper allergic reaction to anything that is sentimental, and he can be sentimental, so we fight about that.
Since there were fewer hands that raised their hand for a Look of Silence than I thought, should we watch the clip from The Look of Silence? Is that okay, Joshua? Is that all right?
Sure, but let me just set it up because it's the very end of the film, and I chose it because it has very little narrative in it. In The Look of Silence, Adi Rukun, the protagonist, goes and confronts all of the men who are still alive, who were involved with killing his brother, and they're still in power. So it's a kind of unimaginable thing to do, and you'll see this clip that I mentioned very briefly earlier of his father crawling through the house, which I mentioned Adi shot. You'll then see his mother greeting the one survivor who survived because he managed to because Adi's brother was murdered, and when Adi's brother was murdered, on his way to be murdered, he escaped from the truck and then was murdered later. He managed to crawl home and then was picked up and taken away to be killed. When he escaped, one other man survived, and you'll see Adi's father. There's a little shot of Adi's mother. Then you'll see Adi's father crawling in the scene I mentioned. Then Adi's mother meeting this survivor for the first time. He survived because her son had rebelled on the way to be killed. And then you'll see a little bit more of Adi watching this old footage I shot, watching early footage I shot with the men who killed his brother, and then you'll see a little bit more of his mother. Probably won't remember that, but you will when you see it.
Aduh. Loh, ini pemilik pelambu. Dia di dalam ibu. Aduh. Loh, coba ke dalam kelambu ni buang. Dah pakai apa ni? Loh. Biar guys. Hindi tolong aku. Kau belum punya kelambu ke sasaran. Tolong, aku belum punya kelambu ni uang. Kau dikepuk uang aku. Disasar aku.
Assalamualaikum.
Salam.
Waalaikum. Alhamdulillah ya Allah.
Kamu selamat.
Yang sudah. Sekarang ya terus terang aja mohon sama Yang Maha Kuasa semoga kita dikasih panjang umur.
Aminahan kan baru nggak bisa juga. Udah nasib anak awak. Kamu selamat. Masuk dalam kolam dia habis kena apa rumput
Ya,
itu.
ya ada beritanya.
Sampai ke rumah dek. Sampai rumah itulah dia ambil katanya bawa rumah sakit.
Ya ada beritanya gitu ada.
Rupanya enggak mungkin juga berpikir aku. Enggak mungkin mbak rumah kan. Aku mau ngikut juga enggak dikasih.
Inilah kejadian Samli yang sebenarnya. Dan yang lainnya saya rasa ya kejadian itu ya serupa tapi tidak sama.
Tidak sama.
Ya, tidak sama, tapi ini kejadian itu dulu yang pernah kami alami pada waktu.
Betul.
Ya. Nah, saya rasa itu singkat aja itu.
Ya, begitulah hidup di dunia ini.
Kalau mau foto, silakan.
Boleh?
Nãy giờ lại trên người ta còn mau Melayu. Mau datang ini, marinya aku lagi. Enggak mau bergerak ini. Inilah turu, enggak capek. Uletnya enggak cetok, enggak enak uletnya. Aku pengen uletnya, itu uletnya, enggak enak uletnya.
We can switch it off.
So I think within that we get the chance to see some of the metaphors that you were talking about, as well as a lot of other things that we've been addressing in this conversation. I'd love to, from that, I feel like there's plenty that we could talk about from having just seen that. It's almost impossible to follow up that film or any clip of that film with anything that does it justice. There's a broader question that I feel like the film addresses even in watching just that short clip, which is that is nonfiction elastic enough for all the things that you want to express? It seems like it is. It seems like there's so many things that so many modes that we see just in those last few minutes of the film, in terms of visual modes, different approaches to the subject. There's recorded footage within footage. There's interview. There's a dramatic scene that we're watching. You ever impatient or feeling like there's more that you want to be able to do that you can do with that you can do within nonfiction cinema, or is it elastic enough?
I think that it's been elastic enough for me. Now I do have some ideas that are, it's been elastic enough for me. Though I'd really love to make a musical. I love Umbrellas of Cherbourg so much. And I also very deeply love this great Taiwanese musical called The Whole by Simon Yang. I would love to make a musical. But the act of killing, at least in the director's cut, is maybe a musical. It's elastic. I think what's interesting I think for me, it's not a matter of it being elastic enough. I think it's also, we talked about this in the summer, I think what excites me, I think what's sacred about nonfiction is that I think that for me at least as a viewer, and I don't know if you share this, it elicits a particular kind of empathy. If you just define nonfiction cinema as people playing themselves or people as themselves, in situations that somehow are coextensive with the rest of their lives and with the world we all inhabit together and the world we share and live in, without, then you know that the stakes, if something is unfolding before the camera that is truly important, then the stakes for the characters are profound because it's their lives and it's our world. And I think that we understand that. And I think that's why so much, I think we understand that. I think that's a kind of magical, sacred thing. Which means if I was to film an image of violence or war, I could never use it for its dramatic propulsion, just as an effective piece of a story that I'm telling. If I was filming people getting tortured or killed or something awful like that, and I think I wouldn't. I'm very queasy and have a weak stomach, so I can't imagine I could film that. But I would, I couldn't just use it for its dramatic effect. I'm talking about real footage of people being harmed, because there would be something sacred to that footage. And for me, it's also why it's very difficult for me in my editing to just put a shot. And again, I have arguments with my editor to just put a shot in that's expedient, that is useful, that takes us from one scene to the next as a transition. I feel like every image is sacred and should have this, it should be inevitable. It should be, and I can actually remember even the 2-hour, 40-minute director's cut of The Act of Killing, which is 3.5 years old now. I can remember it shot by shot, because every shot I feel has to be there. And now I go back, there's a few shots I forget, and that's where I was probably wrong. But basically, I think that it is work, to do nonfiction is to try to work within a sacred space. And I think that you can do that with narrative film in a different way. But I think this idea that you can push reality to express and expose its contradictions. You can grope with people you hardly know at first until they become part of your life. The film becomes part of your life. It will become part of the audience's life. And in a way, precisely where the forces behind our most important problems are finally made visible in a way that you can't just look away. That's a sacred activity, I think.
And Laura, I mean, I think in some ways your piece, your exhibit upstairs, Astro Noise, is a work of nonfiction and is a documentary of sorts in a different space. But not to rely too much on your journals again. But there's a real sense of there's one line from February 26, 2013. You say, why the fuck am I making long-form documentaries when other ways of working are so much more energizing? There's, for you, a clear sense that maybe it's not elastic enough for some of the things that you wanted to say.
No, I was just frustrated. No, I mean, the truth is that, I mean, there's nothing quite like it. I mean, in all the ways that Joshua just described. I mean, there is this kind of relationship that you are completely bound to that's so profound, but it's really hard to do. So that's kind of where that was coming from. But the next piece I'm going to be working on is going to be a plot. There's going to be a character. There's, I'm going back to that, and so I think it demands so much, and I love it. But there is also the thing I think is hardest is in terms of a practice is the ratio, like on a daily basis. Maybe I wish it was more creative on a daily basis, which I felt was really energizing in the work doing with the museum. I had that kind of where I think with you spend a lot of time. Like, what did you do when you weren't filming, and how long were you in the field?
Yeah, so I was altogether. Let's see. So if it was 11 years. making these 2 films, and I was in Indonesia of those 11 years for about 2.5 years. And there was 3 years of editing for the act of killing and post-production, and so that's 5.5 years. And then there was another year with The Look of Silence. It's 6.5 years. Oh no, so 4.5 years disappeared.
But I mean, but I would just there is. I mean, in terms of the elasticity question and working with form, I mean, to me, what the nonfiction and working with that, what it gives you is this kind of things you literally can't imagine. And I actually don't want to be contained by my imagination. I'm actually really interested in the world and what the world can reveal and then respond to it. And that kind of constantly being surprised and having to rethink, preconceptions and be challenged. And so that sort of surrendering to that is, I think, what's so beautiful about nonfiction.
And of course, one thing we do a lot of is prepare, and research and think and plan and log the footage and pore over the footage we have, and that's creative in a different way. The one metaphor that I was thinking about plot. I said storytelling is a kind of maybe feels to me like an inadequate metaphor for what I'm trying to do. But one metaphor I always return to is excavation. It's like kind of excavating layers to find buried secrets, to find hidden connections of the reality I'm looking at. That sounds abstract, but that's what it feels like to me. And maybe because as a kid I was the youngest, so I was always taken to really young. Do you have siblings?
I'm in the middle.
In the middle. So I was the youngest. So I was always taken to movies where I was too young to understand them. And so I maybe have just an inferiority complex with plots. Like when you said 3-act structure, and I don't even remember the ingredients to it, but I started to get nervous. And the other thing was the movies were also always too scary. So I wouldn't watch Mad Max at 3 because Mad Max 2, I suppose. 1. What's the new one? Mad Max 3?
Well, I don't think they number them, but this is the
Fury Road.
This is
Fury
the
Road,
4th.
right?
This is actually the 4th.
The Road Warrior was just, it's a trauma, and I will not go near a theater that's showing Mad Max. That's all I want to say.
But I mean,
Crying and crying. I really was.
I'm going to transition in just a moment, but I love hearing you talk about Mad Max and musicals, and I loved reading through your journals and seeing what you were watching during this time, and to think that you were like, oh, I have to watch 2001: A Space Odyssey in these moments, and it's like, really, that's okay, great. But that's where your mind was going, and that you were grabbing something from that. And I love this notion of not only I think they're probably related, right? And so not only are you impatient with sort of standard received forms for nonfiction storytelling, but you're also grabbing from sources that are all over the place, which probably then helps, break down certain walls that may have been there otherwise. Is that something is that just who you are as people, or is it something you're thinking as you go? I can't look at something that's that is too clear a fit for the stuff that I'm working on. I need something that's coming from a bit from left field that'll influence me in an unpredictable way.
I mean, most of the things that I talk about that I saw were actually rereading 1984, Cory Doctorow's Homeland. There were a lot of going into sort of narratives of surveillance or narratives of paranoia. But actually, I think
but novels as well, which is
I saw 2001. I think I was 4 or 5, so I was really young. So it stuck with me.
And I'll have certain works that dominate my thinking for far too long, like John Dos Passos' USA was stuck in my head for, I don't know, years. And then what really sent me in the wrong direction, it's probably where the 4.5 years went, was when Gertrude Stein's The Making of Americans was stuck in my head, because really only the first paragraph is excellent. And then there's like 1,000 pages, and then the last paragraph is touching too. I look for things too, yeah. And I also spend a lot of time, honestly, is spent doing with me and now, initially just me and now with a team of researchers as I'm moving into new things, is spent in like investigating, and it's a lot of heavy nonfiction books. It's the news. It's on a particular topic. It's human rights reports. It's the things that to just understand the landscape where you're working, and that does take a lot of time, because with my two films there was no. In Denmark, where I'm working and based, a lot of people make films on the basis of the work of filmmakers will partner with an anthropologist, for example, who's done a lot of research and has found characters. And that might have saved some time, but that wasn't the case with my work. There was no one who'd ever researched the killings in North Sumatra before. There was no one who'd ever identified who was doing the killings, how they'd taken place, how killers were speaking and thinking about them. And so that's probably where a lot of that 4.5 years went, was trying to understand what happened here.
I was amazed by the deep roots, or the large iceberg beneath the top, in terms of what's all the work that went into the films that you make, the years that went into it, the research that went into the incidents, the dramas that go on behind the scenes that'll never make it onto the screen, and pointedly aren't part of what's on the screen. Do we have time for questions? Is that something that we should do? What's that? One. We have time for one. So I apologize for this zigzagging and lurching shape, but I think that maybe I was breaking outside the format of the standard panel discussion, so we're creating a new form. Does anybody have a question? Yes, right here. The microphone, yes.
Sorry, I feel this is a really big responsibility now.
Your hand went up. You knew the responsibility.
You should ask a really frivolous question.
So much pressure. Yeah, like your favorite film. No, I'm joking. I was thinking that if you can talk a bit in terms of form and content, because I feel that reading reviews of the say of Josh film, sometimes you're being accused as if your films are too beautiful, that the aesthetics takes away from the message or from the story that you're trying to tell. And then coming from Laura's exhibition, I was thinking that the way you're using low resolution, so the way you're using fragmented, pixelated images and low res is part of the story that you're trying to tell in terms of surveillance. So I wonder, and I think it would be extremely simplistic to say that beautiful or ugly, right? But I wonder if that's something you would like to comment on in terms of the aesthetics of your work.
I'm going to do it really quickly because I think it's a huge question that we're not going to have time to get into. But I don't think resolution matters. I mean, this isn't. If you're talking about the interrogation, it's not about resolution. I mean, it's a historical document, so I'm not really that concerned with. I mean, I'm interested in it as a historical document.
I feel like just thinking about the look of silence, because you've all just seen a clip from it. I had this feeling that I was trying to make a poem, that the film is a kind of poem, I hope, that's composed really in memoriam for what's been destroyed. Not just the people who were murdered 50 years ago, but the lives that have been broken and diminished by half a century of fear and silence. And that means I had to find a way of doing three things. First, I had to find a way of registering the most subtle traces of these invisible forces of fear and silence. And that could be the knitting of Adi's mother's brow. It could be the way water spills down Adi's old father's sort of emaciated torso when Adi's bathing him. It could be these tiny beans that you would see jumping on the side of the lane if you only cared to look. And for me, there's a metaphor of something that cannot be erased from the past. But for a metaphor to work in film, it has to have a mystery beyond that. So that's not an explanation for what that means. It's just a feeling that it gives me in the context of the whole film. So there's that need for a very precise visual language that allows you to register these things. Because in a mess, I don't know what the opposite of what I've been accused of, I haven't really read the accusations, but a messier aesthetic wouldn't perceive those things, perhaps. And then the second thing one has to do is to dignify the lives. The film is painful. It's dealing with what it's like for survivors to live without ever being allowed to mourn, without ever being allowed to publicly acknowledge their grief or work through their grief. And it's painful. There's no resolution that's happy, but on the other hand, if there's a hope in the film, it lies not just in Adi's, the main character's kind of determination to expose the moral truth, the moral catastrophe that took place, but it also lies, the hope perhaps even more lies in the dignity, in the love, and possibly even the grace of the family at the center of the film. And that involves elevating them in the space to something that maybe does appear beautiful. That I don't find that. I find that good because the beauty only makes the horror and the costs of that horror all the more painful, because you see what's being destroyed when people are murdered and destroyed. And then the third thing that I feel that the third task is to find a cinematic language that is capable of photographing and making you feel ghosts. So I was recently at a screening, and my friend from high school, who I hadn't seen in 25 years, came and asked me this question, which I thought was so smart. And I've been talking about this film way longer than I would like to be. And yet he asked this question that I'd never thought of, and it reminded me why I loved him and why he was my friend. And he said, can you talk about why Rohani, Adi's mother, is represented in such an ethereal way? I thought that's strange to use the word ethereal. But then I realized, actually, you heard over the clip we saw this sort of sound of crickets. And there's 16 tracks. All of the sounds over the landscape shots in the film have been removed. And there's 16 or 18, I can't remember, tracks of crickets that are playing like a symphony. And we thought of it as like a chorus of ghosts. And sound is around you and it bathes you. And often from these landscape shots, just as you saw from this shot, you heard Adi's mother's voice speaking. Again and again in the film, we hear her first off over these landscape shots, and then we hear her talking to one of the ghosts, usually, her murdered son. And so I know we're at the end, but there's a picture of her in bed, sitting in bed. Yeah, if you just, that's fine. That's fine. She's photographed in the film in a way that may just look beautiful or pretty, but I hope feels actually ethereal. I hope it actually feels like she's living between the past and the present, in dialogue with ghosts, in dialogue with memory, and perhaps insisting on that thing that we've been talking about, which is that these things must not be overlooked, and they must not be ritually remembered only to make ourselves feel good about that process so that we can then overlook them yet again.
And with that, I think we have to end.